Welcome to week 6. This is our final asynchronous module of the entire semester, and it covers the most ground. The 4 textbook chapters in this module are on 4 completely different topics. To make your life a little bit easier, I've put the 2 textbook chapters that directly relate to your assignments in this video, and then the last 2 chapters, which are interesting but not directly related to any of our course assignments, are in a separate video. Please also watch that one. I did try to make it short, sweet, and worth your time. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about chapters 8 and 9, and then setting up IEP components 3 and 4, as well as the adaptations and analysis assignment. Before we dive in, I want to talk about IEP component part 3, write supplementary aids and services and supports for personnel, because this IEP component doesn't directly line up with any of the chapters in the book. In fact, chapter 8 just assumes that you've already done this. So what we're talking about here is this section and this section of the IEP. Here's the thing about drafting this section. Despite what is shown on this particular page, you are, as a special educator, you're generally only responsible for 2 sections. The first section, most importantly, is the direct services section. That's where you put in the direct services that you provide to students. The drop down on NESIS breaks it down by subject area: reading, math, writing, executive functioning, and a really weird catch-all for behavior. Sometimes the box don't work, or you want to do a combined section for things like working on reading and writing. And you can do that through adding in custom language on NESIS. This is an example of something that my boss feels the state does not like, so I would not recommend this, but it was a custom written in section on an IEP. So example, you can't just write in reading and writing instruction, and I've heard no objections to that, and it can make that page a little bit easier to navigate. But anyhow, so this is where you're going to list how often you as a special education teacher are going to directly work with a student on their goals. Note that the location of services, general education, special education, needs to match what you have in the LRE sections. The related service section is done by related service providers, or at least it should be. At least it should tell you what they want there. Many of our students are going to receive paraprofessional support. If they do, put it in under supplementary services. The more specific that you can be, the better. Are you looking for somebody at recess, at science? Service coordinator for that, if it says paraprofessional, is a special education teacher. If it is a rehabilitative assistant, the service coordinator is almost always going to be your speech and language pathologist. You're also going to need language in the present levels that conforms to the state Medicaid best practices. If you want to know more about that, feel free to ask me in class. But for next class, just bring in a draft of the service page or pages of your IEP, and that's going to be what we're going to count as IEP component section 3. Okay, back to the chapters and the other assignments. Chapters 8 and 9, as well as your 3 assignments, focus on one key question. What does it take to make general education truly accessible for students with disabilities? We're going to start looking at that question through Chapter 8, which is an entire chapter on least restrictive environment. And this is a chapter where I don't really have any recommended skip sections. Even the challenge section is pretty interesting because it doesn't sound like any conversation that I have ever heard in 2+ decades in the field. But I think that maybe that is actually how our conversations should sound. I'm not sure. The entire chapter revolves around 2 boxes on a New Hampshire IEP. The first is the box where you state when, if, and why a student is going to be removed from special education. This is a section that's rarely changed or touched year to year on most New Hampshire IEPs. It'll often have a broad statement like Jose will be removed from general education for weekly check-ins with his case manager, speech group, and reading interventions. The other box that's covered by Chapter 8 is the placement box. That's a section of the IEP at the very end of NESIS where you type in your school, your hours, where services are going to be held. When you check the type of meeting on the IEP cover page on NESIS and check placement, you are triggering that box. And in New Hampshire, any annual IEP is also an IEP placement meeting. AKA, you're going to check that box on the cover page unless you're holding an amendment or a progress monitoring meeting. This chapter is setting up part 4 of your IEP component assignment, so I also want to just go ahead and get into that. While for the other 4 sections of the assignment, you're asked to just bring drafts of IEP sections to the meetings, for this one, you're actually asked to do something slightly different. You need to bring in the content of the box where you state if and how much a student will be pulled from general education and why, but you also need to place where that student is on the LRE continuum, which is on page 169 in your textbook, and defend the placement by answering the self-check questions that are on pages 167 and 168. So you do need to turn in a draft of more than just what you put in that box on the IEP. And here's why. Every time IDEA is reauthorized, which is about every 10-ish years, the law becomes more and more clear. Students with disabilities have the legal right to be educated with their typically developing peers. That's true for students with Down syndrome, it's true for students with learning disabilities, it's true for students with behavioral issues. Unfortunately, it often doesn't happen. It isn't that schools think of themselves as above the law or trying to skirt the regulations and best practices. It's because of all of these exclusives. It's easy to program a day in hours if students are with the special education teacher the whole day. It makes service delivery easy. All of the kids are getting services at once. It makes teacher scheduling and paraprofessional scheduling easy. And it avoids conflict with general education teachers. Once you start trying to get kids really out into general education and meaningfully include them, you have to negotiate when you're going to provide them with services. Do you really have the capacity to do what the book suggests of going into every one of a student's classes for 10 minutes at a time? How are you going to divide up your paraprofessionals and their time to support students if they need support in general education? What are you going to do when you get pushback from general education teachers who don't like behaviors or worry about how to teach the student? Are you going to be writing bonus curriculum materials for every single student on your caseload? The fact is that exclusion is a lot easier for you. It's easier for the general education teachers, it's easier for the paraprofessionals, and it's easier for the administrators. And exclusion has become an ingrained habit. But ignoring LRE or putting content on the placement page that doesn't reflect what actually happens in practice doesn't change the fact that inclusion is the law. And there is an incredible amount of research out there that proves that inclusion is what is best for students. They learn more academically, socially, and behaviorally when they are with their typically developing peers. Other than the section on technology to support LRE, the chapter doesn't have a lot of strategies for making LRE work. But what it does a good job of is explaining what LRE means, what the law is, and how inclusion and mainstreaming differ, which is a key difference to understand if you want to be the one at your site helping make inclusion a reality and not just a term on paper. To me, inclusion is about a child having a home in general education, being part of the community, being accepted, and belonging, the ABCs. Mainstreaming is a child earning their time in general education. The chapter outlines key court cases on LRE. There are times when it is appropriate for a child to be placed outside of general education, but the Supreme Court has been incredibly clear that those are rare exceptions. So the entire chapter is on 2 tiny and too often ignored boxes on New Hampshire IEPs. But the assignment in the chapter are included in this class on IEP writing because placement should be a discussion and about the child, not about what is convenient for the school, which is why if you've worked with an advocate, they'll spend so much time on this issue. So have fun reading, and you have 1 puzzle question, or 2, I can't remember. All right, welcome back for chapter 9. This incredibly long titled chapter is on accommodations and modifications. This chapter actually hits on a 2-1 major course assignment, as well as a few key concepts. Before we discuss anything else about the chapter, I want to briefly talk about Universal Design for Learning, UDL. The chapter has an overview of UDL on pages 190 and 191. I've put the full chart, or most of the full chart, on this slide for the resources for this week. The reason why is because UDL is incredibly helpful for thinking about how to make curriculum and content accessible to learners. That's what accommodations and modifications are all about, but it can be really challenging to figure out where to start and what can be shifted to get a student from stuck to successful. I'm going to briefly go over UDL, how it can be a tool for thinking about accommodations and modifications, and then I'll go ahead and go back to the chapter. So UDL has three big areas. The first one that I'm going to start with is representation because it lines up really well with accommodations. So some of the phrasing is weird, but the perception item, so design options for perception, is hitting on this idea that students might need to see instead of hear information, like having written direction or access to visuals, or have information presented in multiple formats. That could also be listening to audiobooks instead of reading the textbook. Design option for language and symbols has a few things. One is the importance of vocabulary. That might be giving students vocabulary sheets, picture cards of words, cheat sheets of equations, or even access to teachers' notes and slides. Design options for building knowledge is about making learning relevant to a student. An accommodation can be about connecting a new lesson to prior lessons, like a student benefits from hearing explicit connections between new content and previously learned content. The patterns, big ideas, and relationships, that could be thinking about graphic organizers for students or concept webs or idea maps. I think I flipped those two terms. Second key area of UDL is design for multiple means of action and expression. The first area in that is interactions, design options for interactions. Interaction hits on things like movement breaks, standing in the classroom, using assistive technology, using a mouse and not a trackpad. Anything that about how the student is going to interact with the content and with the lesson. Design options for expression and communication, that gets you to think about things like AAC devices or voice to text, or showing photographs of things from home and not just using words. The student used to do that, take home his iPad and he would take photographs of home so that he had things to talk about at school. He could use the photos. Doing picture panels as well as written assignments. Strategy development, that includes things like setting goals before doing assignments, teaching the student organization skills, doing organization checks, and anything in that vein. The final key area of UDL is engagement. Design options for welcoming interests and identities. So this one hits on choice. That might be giving a student a constrained choice. That means a limited choice, like one or two options. Doing that on assignments can be incredibly helpful for some kids. So are connecting assignments back to a student's own life. Design options for sustaining effort and persistence. That hits on things like group work, peer support, feedback. There are a lot of different ways to give feedback, and some might work with a student and some might make them explode. Last area is emotional capacity. This could be things like clarifying expectations for a student, explicitly teaching routines, encouraging reflections and debrief after an incident. All of the things like that are here. Okay, so that was like a massively lightning round of UDL. But I wanted to give a little bit more depth than what the chapter does, because a lot of times I get stuck on trying to figure out what might help a student in class. Having these 9 areas to think about can help me be more creative and see solutions that I might have missed. Page 186 in the book talks about content, process, and product, which is another really helpful way to think about accommodations. In terms of actual accommodations and modifications, I've put a booklet that I created of common accommodations and modifications up on Canvas as a resource for you. It's not exhaustive, but it's something that I created to help myself figure out what might be helpful for a student. All of the accommodations and modifications that I've talked about so far, and almost all of the ones that are in this chapter, are classroom accommodations. Those are changes that you make to routine classroom instruction to make it more accessible for students. While other states have checkboxes here, New Hampshire lets you write in what a student needs. For clarity, I'd strongly recommend doing 1 support per box on NESIS. If there isn't spacing, general education teachers space them out. I also always send a screenshot of this page to general education teachers after an IEP is finalized, along with a note letting them know that the IEP is available, but here's the most important thing for you to know. A lot of teachers don't read IEPs. I want to make sure that this section makes it in front of their eyes. This chapter also hits a bit on testing accommodations. First, they talk about a 1% rule. What it means is that only 1% of students should be taking an alternate state test. The alternate state tests are reserved for students who are not on diploma tracks, that's students who are doing certificates of completion. I can talk more about that in class, but I want to clarify that 1% thing because I thought it was a little bit confusing in the chapter. All right, pivot time. So your key assignment that is related to this chapter is actually due on Friday, so it's due a little bit early. It is the Adaptations, Observations, and Analysis assignment. Your job is to observe your class or someone else's and to look for the accommodations and modifications that are being used. Then you have to analyze them. Are they helping? Are they giving the student independence? Are there things that are missing? You can write a paper, you can do a slideshow, do whatever makes sense to you. The grading is based on first, identifying 10 adaptations, accommodations, or modifications. Second, did you identify whether it was an accommodation or modification? The chapter has guidelines on this. Did you tell how it's impacting a student's learning and whether or not it was supporting their independence? And 3, unmet needs. Did you identify at least 2 needs of the students that weren't being met and something that could be done to address them? And finally, professionalism. Did you turn in a master's class worthy piece of work? If you have questions on this assignment, please reach out. And that's all, folks. There is another Edpuzzle question and then a much shorter video on the last 2 chapters of the book. But you should have everything that you need to knock off those 3 assignments, which are due either Friday or next week. Good luck and happy IEP writing.